If you queued up a generic video entitled "Epic Russian Army Fails" before February 2022, you might have expected to find humorous compilations of drunk Russian soldiers playing harmless pranks on one another, mishandling live grenades, or marching comically out of lockstep. To tell the truth, it might not have been all that different from your standard Epic US Army Fails compilation. But times have changed, and since Russia's 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine, its military has chalked up an impressive list of tactical, operational, and strategic failures which have attrited their once-feared invasion force beyond comprehension. Cataloging a comprehensive list of these failures is impossible. The YouTube compilation video would rival the length of any Greek tragedy or comedy, depending on your perspective. Still, we have tried to come up with a list of major shortcomings which have had the most significant bearing on the conflict's outcome. Here are 6 major military failures committed by Russia in the war against Ukraine since the 2022 invasion. Number 1. The failure to capitalize on the capture of Hostomel Airport. From the start of its unlawful invasion, Russia's hopes rested on the premise that its armed forces could rapidly encircle Kyiv, decapitate its political leadership, install a pro-Russian regime, and place itself in a strong position for negotiations. The quicker this happened, the less time Russia would afford the West to unite and intervene, and with hindsight, we know this mattered a lot. Ultimately, speed, precision, and grit were the difference between the conflict becoming Russia's version of the Gulf War or Passchendaele with drones. It's no secret that Putin's plan went spectacularly awry. The cornerstone of the invasion was, in fact, the Hostomel Airport, a key military airfield and logistical hub with one of the longest runways in Eastern Europe, just 10 kilometers northwest of Kyiv. The battle for Hostomel lasted less than 36 hours, was the first major battle of the Russo-Ukrainian War, and a decisive event in the war, and was a perfect example of how a tactical setback can snowball into operational stagnation. The plan was simple, conceived as a traditional airfield envelopment and seizure, followed by the insertion of elite airborne battalions in transport planes. Once on the ground, Russia's airborne troops would secure the city, overthrowing, assassinating, or forcing Zelensky's cabinet into exile. Putin truly believed Zelensky's government would capitulate in 3 to 4 days, the first of his many strategic blunders. In this, he severely underestimated Ukrainian resolve. There was plenty of risk in the Hostomel plan. It wasn't a traditional combined arms operation targeting Ukraine's armed forces in the field. It was a political coup de main, a surgical attack which sought to avoid a large, publicly shocking set-piece battle. Ancillary thrusts elsewhere across the country were designed in part to paralyze Ukraine's armed forces and spread them thin, maximizing Russia's chances. Russia had already tried a number of these high-risk, high-reward strategies in the past, with mixed results. It happened in Czechoslovakia in 1968, in Afghanistan in 1979, in Kosovo in 1999, and in Crimea in 2014. According to a group of Western Soviet experts, if anything, the attempt on Hostomel was stereotypical of prior regime change operations, equally reminiscent of their failed attempt to secure Grozny in 1994, when a multi-pronged assault into the heart of the city went badly during the First Chechen War. Russia likes shock and awe, and to achieve regime change, it follows a somewhat predictable blueprint: seize the capital's biggest airport, funnel in elite airborne forces, decapitate the political leadership, and prime the broader operational effort. The crazy thing is that Russia had all sorts of infiltrators in place across Kyiv prior to the attack. For months, saboteurs and spies tasked with enabling the Russian advance into the city went about funneling intelligence back to Moscow, marking landing zones, securing infrastructure, and more. Their efforts achieved little. Incredibly, in the same way many Russian soldiers were surprised that their initial deployment along the border on exercise had transitioned to a complex scheme for a large-scale invasion involving tight timetables and numerous axes of attack, many of Russia's saboteurs were likewise fuzzy on the details of Putin's plan. Fortunately, Ukrainian intelligence and police officers uncovered and arrested most of these infiltrators before the invasion truly had kicked off. On the morning of February 24th, the assault commenced as an aerial convoy of around 34 Mi-8 HIP transport helicopters and dozens of Ka-52 Alligator and older Mi-24 attack helicopters advanced along the infiltration corridor into Kyiv's airspace. The 200 to 300 VDV paratroopers securing the airport expected minimal resistance. They were inserted at the southern tip of the airfield, while attack helicopters raked stationary defenses to the north. Ukrainian Major Vitaly Rudenko, commander of the small garrison of National Guard forces defending the site, was apparently unaware of the approaching helicopters until he heard the chopping of the helicopter's rotor blades. His troops were ill-suited for the task, to say the least. Ukraine's 4th Rapid Reaction Brigade was a newly organized combined arms entity created along NATO standards, with infantry, tanks, artillery, and surveillance drones working in tandem. The problem for Rudenko was that his superiors had expected the weight of the attack to come in the Donbass and deployed most of the 4th Brigade heavy weapons out east. The 200 men left to defend the airfield were rear echelon forces, most of them new conscripts wielding small arms, a few older Igla manpads, and a towed AA gun. According to one expert, they were more akin to finance officers than infantry officers. Still, they did their best, with 20 of them defending the radar at the northern extreme of the airfield with the AA gun, while the rest called in reinforcements and dug in to defend the airfield from the VDV in the south. Moving large vehicles onto the tarmac to prevent fixed-wing aircraft from landing, the defenders quickly shot down a Russian Ka-52 helicopter with an Igla, which boosted their morale. They would repeat this feat 3 more times in the next 2 hours as ammunition ran low. In the end, they simply couldn't hold the airfield, conducting a controlled evacuation to the outskirts of Hostomel while massing reinforcements. The Russians had prepared 1,000 reinforcements of their own they hoped to insert earlier in the day, but the helicopter losses, Ukrainian artillery fire hitting the airfield, and inability of the Russian airborne to control the surrounding vicinity forced them to abort their plan. This was, by all measures, a pivotal moment in the then nascent fight, and to this day, nobody is certain why Russia's reinforcement plan was abandoned. Russian hopes then rested on the set of advancing mechanized columns coming in from Belarus. They had only 79 miles to reach Kyiv, but as they drove through the narrow corridor through Chernobyl and Ivankiv, they encountered resistance of their own, leaving the Russian VDV isolated at Hostomel. Ukraine's military leadership recognized the importance of the moment and ordered an immediate counterattack to retake the airfield. With a motley force of older veterans, civilian volunteers, and brand new conscripts, they organized a combined arms attack which commenced at sunset on February 24th. They were grateful to discover that the Russian airborne soldiers failed to occupy good defensive positions and found it fairly easy to dislodge them. Were Russia's vaunted elite this tactically inept? One Ukrainian soldier described engaging the minimally protected Russian forces on the airfield as being like playing a video game, just shooting and knocking them down from our positions outside the airfield. By evening's end, the Ukrainians had sent the Russians airborne into retreat. It would be recaptured the next day, but would never serve as the air bridge Russia needed. Thankfully, delays to the advancing Russian mechanized column from Belarus removed the element of surprise and gave Ukraine breathing space to mount a credible defense of Kyiv. Russia's haphazard attack on Hostomel seemed to have no alternative or viable plan B. There were plenty of weaknesses to exploit on the city's western side during the first week of that war, but Russia was bent on a direct assault from Hostomel into the city center. The failure to enact a complete encirclement of the city saw Russian units bogged down in cramped suburbs and urban environments where their advantage of mechanized mobility could be easily countered by marauding, lightly equipped squads of Ukrainian guerrillas. Consequently, the failure at Hostomel ushered in a whole host of compounding supply issues, strangled Russian lines of communication, opened up bogged-down Russian convoys to ambush, and vastly bolstered not only Ukraine's morale, but Western confidence in their ability to win. More importantly, it disavowed the notion of any inherent Russian military superiority on the basis of geopolitical reputation or economic power alone. By March 25th, the Russians had withdrawn from Kyiv. By April 1st, Hostomel was cleared, dissolving any lingering Russian hopes of winning the war quickly. Number 2. Snake Island – losing the information war. There was a lot more happening on the first day of the invasion than the seizure of Hostomel. Out on a rocky outcropping in the Black Sea known as Snake Island, a tiny garrison of 13 Ukrainian defenders were busy gaining international renown when asked by a Russian warship waiting offshore to lay down their weapons and surrender to avoid bloodshed and unnecessary victims, or else suffer immediate bombardment. In response, one of them, Roman Shrybov, issued his famous retort to the Russian missile cruiser Moskva: "Russian warship, go F yourself." The Snake Island defenders were all reported killed in action by the Ukrainian government after the audio clip of their courageous last stand went viral. But as it turned out, most of its garrison had actually lived, taken into captivity as prisoners. Released 1 month later in a prisoner exchange back in March of 2022, Rybov was awarded a Decoration of Valor and, with his peers, immortalized as a hero of Ukraine. The struggle for Snake Island and the defenders' unabashed defiance quickly became a slogan in the country's fight for survival. Commemorated just a few weeks later on a national postage stamp, the episode epitomized the pluck, courage, and composure with which the Ukrainian armed forces conducted themselves in the war thus far. For many Westerners with ancestors who themselves fought for independence against despotic tyranny, the rallying cry struck a familiar chord. It was one of many instances where, almost immediately, Ukraine demonstrated it was intent on winning the information war against their enemy. While Russia has shown little aptitude for controlling or caring about the message it sends to the world, Ukraine has not lost ground in this domain ever since. Number 3. The inability to prevent the sinking of the Moskva. Maybe instead of targeting Snake Island, the Moskva should have picked on someone its own size. Fittingly, our next failure on the list was Russia's inability to prevent the Moskva's sinking, which was, ironically, critically damaged in an attack by Ukrainian anti-ship missiles just a few weeks after its Snake Island run-in, and sank the following day on April 14, 2022. Having received intelligence and targeting data on the Moskva's whereabouts from American intelligence agencies, the Ukrainian Navy planned a strike on the flagship vessel of the Black Sea Fleet, which had, since Soviet times, intervened in conflicts from Georgia to Syria. All it took were 2 R-360 Neptune anti-ship missiles to start a fire large enough to cause the ship's munitions to cook off and explode. The cruiser reportedly sank in stormy seas shortly thereafter, the largest Russian warship to be sunk in wartime since the end of World War II, and the first Russian flagship since Knyaz Suvorov in 1905 during the Russo-Japanese War. Recognizing its dependence on Western support early in the war against Russia revealed Ukraine's penchant for delivering high-profile, if isolated, successes to demonstrate their competence in utilizing the inflow of military assistance. Russia tried to cover up the incident at first, claiming that the fire had been accidental and that it had been contained by Russian sailors. When the Moskva literally failed to surface on camera ever again, the Russian Ministry of Defense conceded it had sunk, this time while being towed in stormy seas. What is most eye-opening is that the Moskva had a triple-tiered air defense that could have provided an adequate chance of intercepting the incoming Neptune missiles, with 3 to 4 minutes of radar detection. In a variation on a recurring theme, it appeared that the ship's crew failed to activate these systems, including the S-300F and 9K-33 OSA surface-to-air missiles, chaff or decoys, electronic jamming, or the last-ditch AK-630 close-in weapon systems. One Turkish correspondent claimed the snafu implied a lack of crew training for such emergency scenarios. And that is what is so damning about the entire incident, whether it was sheer incompetence or, as another Danish military analyst surmised, operator fatigue. The fact remains that Russian sailors transformed a situation where an expensive vessel, which could have almost assuredly survived several Neptune missile strikes, with some simulations even hinting that it would take at least 7 to guarantee the vessel's sinking, was sunk using only 2. The Moskva, according to retired US Navy captain and former director of operations at US Pacific Command's Joint Intelligence Center, was perhaps the largest warship ever disabled or destroyed by a missile. Today, Russia lacks the economic or industrial capacity to easily replace such a vessel. Its loss was humiliating to Russian President Vladimir Putin, a psychological strain which demonstrated Ukraine's ability to employ sophisticated weaponry effectively, forced the Russian Navy to move much of its battle group farther from the Ukrainian coastline, and further underpinned Russia's narrative of incompetence, which has proliferated after the attack. Hilariously, in April 2022, Ukraine began referring to the sunken vessel as a world-class dive site with underwater cultural heritage. Just 130 kilometers off the coast of Odessa, it can be admired without much diving, in water just 45 to 50 meters deep. Online tour offices still promote the wreck as the most interesting spot for diving in the Black Sea, with the best time to visit listed as after the Ukrainian victory over Russia. Number 4. The failure to achieve air superiority. From the depths of the Black Sea, we travel to the airspace over Ukraine, where, Whichever way you cut it, you've probably been left wondering the same thing as everyone else. What on earth has happened to Putin's vaunted air force? Try as they might, Russian combat aviators have failed to establish any kind of air superiority over the battlefield thus far. Part of their problem rests with technological advances made in the 1970s, which made it possible to furnish vulnerable infantry with their own portable handheld anti-aircraft missiles too. Man-portable air defense systems, or MANPADS, are simple and cost-effective shoulder-fired rockets that lock onto aircraft using infrared homing. They can be taught to new users in a matter of a few minutes. Knowing Russia's numerically superior air force would play a central role in the opening phases of its invasion of Ukraine back in February of 2022, Western nations rushed thousands of MANPADS into Ukrainian hands to shore up their air defenses. These included American Stinger missiles, surplus Soviet Iglas, and British laser-guided, high-velocity Starstreak systems. The gamble paid off. Cheap MANPADS made it much harder for Russia's air force to establish aerial supremacy, imposing steep, asymmetrical costs on Russian pilots who could no longer safely approach priority targets in Ukrainian airspace. For the price of one 60,000 to 80,000 Igla, Ukrainian soldiers can down a $36 million Su-34 bomber or an $85 million Sukhoi Su-35S fighter. That's real bang for your buck. This has had real repercussions all over the battlefield. Modern combined arms warfare hinges on effective cooperation between all service branches – air, armor, artillery, and infantry. Because Russia has thus far been unable to provide active, continuous air cover for its ground units, tanks, logistics convoys, artillery, and infantry have been repeatedly caught out in the open and destroyed over the course of the war, a spectacle played out almost daily in combat footage littering social media for the entire world to see. This isn't to say Russian aircraft are not present over the battlefield or that Ukraine enjoys its own air superiority. Far from it. Russian aircraft make overflights every single day, but most last only a few seconds, with fighter bombers flying in pairs or groups of 4, ingress to a target area at low altitude, maybe 50 meters or less, and then lob the rockets and bank left or right and return back to base. Rather than hover over the front, far slower helicopters tend to operate similarly as airborne artillery platforms, approaching the contact line, firing their salvos of unguided rockets, and departing as quickly as possible. This has made it even harder for Ukrainian infantry to shoot down Russian aircraft. Constant vigilance is required since little warning is given. Since timing is everything, concealed Ukrainians tend to target slower Su-20 fighter bombers and helicopters like the Mi-8. Hefting an 18-kilogram Igla onto your shoulder while sprinting out into the open, trying to hold it steady to get a lock while the target zips overhead, then launching the missile knowing you're in mortal danger, all within a span of 15 seconds or less. Can you imagine how difficult that must be? The decentralization of air defense made possible by MANPADS like the Stinger has helped limit the effectiveness of Russian air power, but it hasn't blunted it altogether. According to former Staff Sergeant and Green Beret David Bramlett, a combat veteran who recently spent 11 months fighting the Russians in Ukraine, Russia could still turn things around if Western support wavers. Russian air superiority, he argued, would be the worst-case scenario for Ukraine at this point. If Russia can gain air superiority, it's going to be an entirely different battlefield, and the Ukrainians are going to have a very, very hard time of putting up a conventional resistance. Lucky for Ukraine, Russia also has its own incompetence to thank in part for its lack of air superiority. Recently, accidents have taken their toll on Russian aircraft, with 6 crashes alone registered over the span of 2 months in late 2022. The slew of accidents reflects the toll the war has had on Russian aviation writ large. Reflecting on aerial crashes, Michael Bonnet, an engineer and analyst at RAND Corporation, noted that what's interesting is that even aircraft not involved in the Russian invasion are crashing. In an interview with Business Insider, he said that while mechanical failures are expected in aircraft over time, a rapid increase in fleet-wide mechanical failures may indicate that something fundamental has changed. So what has changed? The war has placed immeasurable strain on Russian aviation. Colossal losses early in the conflict contributed to Russia's tendency to adopt more risk-averse tactics, playing a subordinate role to Russia's ground troops, according to Guy Plopsky, an Israeli defense analyst and Russian expert. In just 8 months, Russian combat aviators flew an average 150 sorties a day for a total of 34,000 combat sorties. but the number of sorties has greatly diminished. From an early high of 300 per day, Britain's Ministry of Defense estimates that now Russia probably conducts tens of missions per day. Very few of those sorties actually enter Ukrainian airspace. General wear and tear can be expected in any war, but the immense toll has seriously impacted Russia's pool of 7,500 relatively inexperienced pilots, who are said to receive roughly 100 hours of flight time per year, 1/3 less than their NATO counterparts. The lack of training limits their ability to conduct the type of massive air campaigns Western armies almost take for granted. The lack of qualified pilots is only one part of the problem. Russia also lacks skilled mechanics or the proper tools to make and fix the parts needed to keep Russia's modernized air fleet up to snuff. The fact that the pre-war stockpiles are dilapidated and rapidly diminishing only adds to the problem as the demand for specialized parts and repair tools grows. Russia has tried to mobilize greater amounts of manpower to address the human part of the problem, which, as you can imagine, has its own issues. Just like training pilots, you have to train the repair crews to diagnose and maintain extremely complex computer avionics and technical systems. That is, if you can get them. Herein lies another problem with Russia's Air Force. While mobilization certainly affected the small and medium-sized companies that make aviation parts, the random crashes and accidents began happening prior to mobilization. The shortage of manufacturing tools was already going on, which means Western sanctions may have had a role to play. Russia has been left in an economic and industrial vice by the West, squeezed out of many of its traditional import-export markets, where it has received the critical components it needs to keep its planes airworthy. Ultimately, there's no out-and-out answer as to why Russia has failed to establish air superiority. It's likely that a combination of factors, wear and tear, stress on older airframes, a lack of pilots and trained air crews, and Western sanctions, have each played a significant role. What we do know is that thanks in part to their own outstanding courage, adaptability, and resilience, coupled with the material support they've received from the West, Ukraine has managed to do a lot with a little in terms of its own air defense. Number 5. Russian armor failing in Ukraine. It's been said that the only thing getting more airtime than Russia's ailing air force these days are the airborne turrets of its exploding tanks. Boy, can those things fly. Russia has lost well over 2,300 tanks since it invaded Ukraine. Hundreds more have been abandoned or captured. As its armored force dwindles, it's had to pour older and older armor into the Ukrainian meat grinder. The country, once touting its next-generation T-14 Armata, is now sending T-62s and T-54s into battle. It's a bad look. There are many reasons for Russia's armored failures thus far. Western weapons have helped tip the scales, with humble but deadly anti-tank guided missiles like the Javelin, NLAW, and AT-4 becoming symbols of Ukraine's stubborn resistance. There's other reasons too. Russia's tactical ineptitude deserves blame. Untrained conscripts rarely work in tandem with supporting armored units. Logistics and the lack of fuel, rations, and ammunition at forward supply dumps have wreaked havoc on Russian columns. Lastly, Western sanctions make it harder for Russia to source the specialized parts it needs to repair and maintain newer tanks. Back in November 2022, the Pentagon announced that Russia had lost half of its main battle tanks in combat. Huge losses were inflicted during the Kharkiv counteroffensive last autumn. The Russian army was reportedly losing 10 tanks per day, while the Ukrainians were losing just 2. Jarring figures when you consider the Russians were defending rather than attacking. The Russians are still building tanks to replace their losses, but can they be introduced faster than current models are being destroyed? The simple answer is no, unless they can give the American arsenal of democracy during World War II a run for its money and build dozens of tanks, trucks, and other vehicles every single day, the average rate they were being destroyed at the end of last year. No country on Earth has managed to replicate even a fraction of that type of industrial output in wartime ever since, so can we really assume Russia would be the first? No, I don't think so. Russia has thousands of old Soviet tanks in storage, including versions of the newer T-90s, T-80s, and their time-tested predecessors that make up the backbone of the Ukrainian armored force, the T-72 and the T-64. But most of the footage we've seen depicts Russian T-62s being modernized at Russian armor repair plants and shipped to the front. These tanks are nothing short of obsolete in the modern era, and have been since they started to be replaced back in 1975. Which begs the question, Why are they bothering with these Cold War relics at all? A lot of it has to do with how hard it is to maintain newer tanks in storage, since they operate using more sophisticated electronic components that, as we all know, are more and more difficult to source. It seems that Russia has tried to pull bunches of T-72s, T-80s and T-90s out of storage only to realize how expensive and difficult it might be to make them combat-ready. A fair portion of these were probably mothballed to begin with. Tanks left in storage without maintenance atrophy. Rubber treads and wheels crack and chip. Mice chew through exposed wires. Armor rusts and corrodes. It's a real nightmare scenario for Russian mechanics. The humble T-62, like the T-54 before it, was mass-produced with one idea in mind: make it simple, make it good, and make a crap ton of them. Simple designs mean fewer electronics, greater ease of repair, and interchangeability of parts. Like that old reliable 1966 Chevy you have in your shed, no matter how many years go by, you can always throw it up on the blocks, tinker with the carburetors, and get it to start right up. That's the type of tank the T-62 was. The fact Russia had something in the region of 20,000 of these in storage at the end of the Cold War means there are plenty of stocks to draw from. The bigger question is whether or not it's even worth it. Would Americans be happy if the US Army started dusting off old Vietnam vintage M60 patterns from storage, slapping on a fresh coat of paint, better comms, and a pair of thermal sights and said, "Go to and prosper"? Of course not. But when has the Kremlin cared what its soldiers think? Repair plants across Russia are now churning out oodles of Cold War antiques. Most of these, museums on tracks, culled from deep storage, have not seen combat in decades, if at all, and their maintenance records reflect that. Some are being fitted with new engines, thermal imaging, bulkier armor, new comms, better optics, and cope cages. It probably won't be enough to protect their crews from certain destruction. Number 6. Failure to adequately prepare new recruits for combat. Speaking of Putin's indifference for his countrymen, our next failure revolves around the inability of the Russian government and military to adequately train and outfit their recruits for combat. In the war's first year, Ukraine reversed its dire position and engineered dual counteroffensives, which achieved success beyond most people's wildest imagination. In just over 8 months, Russia has lost somewhere in the region of 90,000 irrecoverably wounded, lost, or killed soldiers. A number that has by now far eclipsed the total casualties the Soviet Union sustained during 9 years of brutal combat in Afghanistan between 1979 and 1989. Notably, Putin lost more soldiers in a week than the United States lost in 20 years in Afghanistan. Putin reacted by announcing sweeping calls to mobilize new recruits for frontline service. This created chaos in a country which had, until then, been relatively insulated from the realities of the conflict. Many military-age draftees did everything in their power to avoid conscription, fleeing on planes and trains, and where that failed, on bicycles, scooters, and on foot. Satellite imagery and social media posts revealed miles-long traffic jams at Russia's borders with Georgia, Finland, Mongolia, and Kazakhstan, among others. Thousands of cars and piles of abandoned bicycles attested to the scale of dissatisfaction. In Russia itself, images of forcibly repressed protesters, some of whom were whisked into military service themselves, littered social media, as Russian officials around the country went door-to-door delivering draft notices. Draconian laws in place prevent anyone from criticizing Putin's special military operation. Enlistment officers scoured the country for draft-age males. Under Russian law, men eligible for conscription must be handed a draft notice in person. As you might expect, evasion strategies revealed the ingenuity of many Russian males, some moving to summer cabins or disappearing on indefinite camping excursions in the countryside. Others disabled their doorbell so they wouldn't hear enlistment officers. Some even injured themselves as a way to gain a medical exemption. Not everyone had the luxury of leaving the lives they'd grown accustomed to. Tied to their homes by elderly parents, mortgages, or financial limitations, the unlucky were ushered into an uncertain military future. Draftees ran the gamut from 17-year-olds with no combat experience to avowed criminals and middle-aged men with diabetes and brain conditions. There was little regard for health, expertise, or background, even though Putin's draft specifically called for reservists with military skills. Naturally, the cannon fodder label has been applied to these new recruits, a common refrain among the men themselves, if scores of anecdotal Telegram videos are to be believed. Zinc coffins are already coming. One jaded Russian military blogger complained, as the mobilization unfolded. You told us that there would be training, that they would not be sent to the front line in a week. Were you lying again? The bottom line is that the mobilization revealed stark structural manpower deficits, which, according to Michael Kaufman, led to problems with recruitment, retention, and rotation. Units which couldn't be rotated were quickly exhausted in combat, which led to the hiring of short-term volunteers, which further exacerbated the retention issues. It was a deadly cycle, one which saw Russian conscripts used up faster than a one-ply roll of toilet paper. Russian conscripts were eventually refused the right to refuse deployment, punishable by fine or a prison sentence. Others expecting to serve for only a few months saw their service in Ukraine extended indefinitely. The bigger red flag was the way these recruits were being trained for combat. In the past, Russian law stipulated that conscripts could not go into battle unless they'd had at least 4 months of training. Russia's own defense ministry website claims that an intensive 4-week combined arms training with a survival course is essential for anyone who signs a contract with the Russian army. The program takes a total of 240 hours and includes shooting, throwing grenades, and a study of military tactics. Today, these standards are not observed. Incredibly, for such a vast mobilization in such a high-stakes war, there seems to be no uniform training regimen in place at all. In fact, reports commonly surface of conscripts being sent to the front mere days after joining the army, raising red flags across the globe. A week of training is nothing for a soldier. It's a direct path to a hospital or a body bag, one independent military analyst told journalists. Another director of a Russian human rights organization said that he'd been regularly approached by parents whose children signed a military contract and ended up in Ukraine just a week later. Another conscript was quoted as saying, "After all the medical checkups, they asked me if I was ready to go to the military base the day after tomorrow. They trained us for 5 days. We waited for another 5 days for a force rotation, and then we went to combat positions." Of the informal training exercises his group conducted while waiting to deploy, he would remark, "Of course, it was not enough. There are grave supply and housing issues. There aren't enough vehicles or munitions to cycle to the rear to train on. Pulling antiquated vehicles and equipment from storage has been one temporary solution, but much of it requires extensive maintenance." As such, reports revealed how conscripts sent to the front had barely held a machine gun or seen a real tank, let alone operate them. Asked about his shooting practice during his 11-day training period before deployment, one conscript said he trained once, with 3 magazines in total. Others practiced marching in street clothes. No machine guns, nothing. No clothes, no shoes. Half of them are hungover, old, at risk. The ambulance should be on duty, the man grimly continued. "There was a soldier in our company who didn't know how a machine gun works, so I taught that guy how to disassemble and assemble a machine gun. I wouldn't want to be next to him in battle. How can you fight like that?" There were not enough beds or heated houses to accommodate the conscripts when they arrived for training. Russian sources revealed men without sleeping bags or blankets sleeping on hard floors or in streets, many of whom were barely fed, others sick or starving. Consequently, disorderly conduct was common. Shockingly, within a short span, hundreds of thousands of new draftees were deployed to Ukraine. Their presence confirmed the observation that the Russian military currently prioritizes getting personnel to the frontline positions in Ukraine quickly and appears to view the quality of their training as an afterthought. Yes, one could argue that history is in fact on Russia's side. They have thrown countless millions into the meat grinder of war dating back to Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812, a trend that continued strong through both world wars and survives well into the 21st century. All Russian battlefield success, it seems, comes only when unfeeling leaders are willing to pay an incredibly steep price, expending men and materiel as cannon fodder until the enemy exhausts himself. Putin should continue at his own peril. Conclusion: there are countless other tactical and systemic issues which, in the interest of time, we'll have to table for a future episode. These include Russia's abject failure to implement a vile deception plan or achieve any form of surprise when it massed in Belarus prior to the invasion, Putin's more recent failure to control his own mercenary subordinates, Russia's inability to protect its own airspace against a growing fleet of cheap Ukrainian drones, the failure to instill operational security, which led to the deaths of dozens of high-ranking generals and officers to artillery, drone, and HIMARS attacks, and Putin's decision to let the war drag on indefinitely, which has only given Ukraine time to iterate and innovate novel military killing techniques, which continue to rain down impressive destructive power on Russian forces. These only scratch the surface. In the meantime, let us know what we missed in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.